I remember the way the faucet coughed that morning. It wasn't much, just a brief stutter, a little hiccup in the stream. But it was enough to make me pause. I was rinsing out my coffee pot same way I had every morning for the past 12 years since retiring here, and I could feel that something wasn't right with the water. At first, I chalked it up to old plumbing. My cabin sat on a quiet slope just outside the main subdivision grandfathered in before the HOA lines were ever drawn. I had my own well, a deep one sunk back in the early 80s. That well had never let me down. Through drought, storms, and everything in between, it kept flowing. Clean, cold, reliable. It was one of the reasons I bought this land after 24 years in the Army. I wanted something that couldn't be taken away, something no one could control. But that morning, the water pressure was weak. It sputtered again at lunch, then completely stopped while I was rinsing the mud off my boots later that afternoon. It returned after a few minutes, but the flow had lost its old strength. I checked the wellhead out back. Everything looked intact, no signs of tampering, no fresh tracks in the dirt around the pump house. The gauge showed a dip in pressure, but not catastrophic. Still, it nagged at me. Something didn't feel right. I made a note to dig deeper after dinner. That night, the hum of my ceiling fan didn't help me sleep. My thoughts kept drifting to the pipes, to the sudden inconsistency, and to the vague conversation I'd had with Karen Wilmot 2 weeks earlier. Karen, president of the Oak Crest Homeowners Association, queen of the covenants and codes, self-declared savior of suburban aesthetics. She'd stopped by coincidentally one morning while I was planting tomatoes and asked how my well worked. "I've always been curious," she'd said, sipping from a travel mug that matched her pressed khakis. "It must be so quaint, having your own water." Quaint, that's the word she used. Like I was living in some antique fantasy and she was humoring it. I told her the well worked fine, and had for decades. She smiled too long and asked if I'd ever considered sharing it with the community in case of emergencies. "No," I had said, looking her dead in the eyes. "That water is mine." She left soon after, but now her words rang in my head louder than the fan blades above. The next morning, I woke up early. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight and wrench, and headed to the pump house while the sky was still a dusty gray. My well system wasn't complicated, but it was secure until now. The lock on the main valve box wasn't broken, but it had been re-screwed with different screws, not mine. Someone had tampered with it and tried to hide the evidence. My stomach turned. I opened the valve housing and found what I feared, a secondary line had been installed, a split carefully done, but unmistakably new. It ran underground away from my property line, not toward my garden or irrigation. My well had been tapped, and it wasn't done by amateurs. I followed the direction the new line headed past the cedar trees and through the back trail that bordered the subdivision. After about 100 yards, I reached the edge of HOA-controlled land, a small maintenance shed used for irrigation systems and greenbelt beautification, as they called it. The pipe led directly underneath. I stood there for a long while, breathing slowly. In the Army, you learn how to manage your reaction. You don't scream, you don't panic, you observe, you gather, then you strike. So I did what I was trained to do. I went back to the house. I photographed everything, every angle, every mark, every pipe. I recorded timestamps, dug up a copy of the original "Well Permit My Property" lines, the subdivision blueprints from the county recorder's office. I built a file, quietly, thoroughly. Then I called my old friend Stan from my days stationed at Fort Bliss. He wasn't military anymore, he worked for the county water resource department. And I knew Stan didn't like bullies, especially those in khakis and power-tripping board seats. "Sounds like someone's been thirsty," he said over the phone, trying to keep it light. "You got anything in writing from the HOA?" "Not yet," I said. "But I've got something better. I've got evidence." He told me to keep it quiet, and under no circumstances should I tamper with the line yet. "They're committing a felony," he said. "If they're pulling water from a private well without a contract, that's theft, period." That night, I attended the monthly HOA meeting like I always did, silent in the back, unnoticed. Karen was up front, as usual, rambling about drought preparedness plans and community water resilience. She even mentioned leveraging supplemental sources in adjacent properties. I almost laughed. Instead, I raised my hand. "I have a question," I said, standing. Karen smiled, tight-lipped. "Yes, Mr. Granger. I was wondering if you'd like to explain why there's a new pipe running from my private well to your maintenance shed." The room went silent. Eyes turned. One board member dropped their pen. Karen's face twitched, but she recovered fast. I'm not sure what you mean. That doesn't sound accurate. I have pictures, I said, measurements, timestamps, and I've already spoken to the county. For a second, I saw the crack in her composure. Her smile slipped. She looked not at me, but at one of the board members, a flicker of panic. Then she tried the usual trick. You'll need to direct any legal accusations through proper HOA channels, she said, voice clipped. And I advise you not to spread unfounded rumors. It could be considered slander. Slander, I wanted to laugh, but I stayed calm. I'm sure the county will be very careful with their language, I replied. After all, they're coming out for a site visit on Friday. I left before she could respond, but I could feel her eyes burning into my back. Something told me Karen hadn't counted on anyone fighting back, especially not someone like me, retired quiet, supposedly out of the loop. She thought I'd just turn on the tap and hope for the best, but she had underestimated two things: how much that well meant to me, and how far I'd go to protect what was mine. The first time Karen ever set foot on my property, she made a face like she'd stepped in something unpleasant. She stood at the edge of my gravel driveway, arms folded across her branded HOA windbreaker, eyeing the chicken coop and the vegetable beds like they were offensive to her sensibilities. It was early spring back then, 3 weeks before the water pressure dropped, and she claimed she was just making her neighborhood rounds. I should have known then something was off. She leaned against her SUV and offered a plastic smile, the kind that stretched wide but didn't reach her eyes. You know, Mr. Granger, she said, you've got such a rustic setup here. It's very self-reliant, very off-grid chic. I just kept raking the mulch. She walked a few steps closer and tilted her head. I was wondering, do you ever get concerned, about running out of water or not being part of the HOA's broader infrastructure plan? I straightened up and looked her dead in the eye. No, I said, because I don't need your infrastructure. I've got something that works. Karen smiled again, wider this time, but her eyes flickered with something sharper. Well, she said slowly, some of the board members were just wondering. We've had a lot of new families move in, and with the drought forecast this year, we're exploring redundancy options, backup sources, emergency contingencies. I leaned on my rake. You're not touching my well. There was a pause, brief but icy. Then she laughed, brushing it off like I was being paranoid. Of course not. It was just curiosity. You know me, big on community conversations. And then she left. But what I didn't know at the time was that she'd already brought it up at the last board meeting, my name, my well, and the supposed opportunity for a shared water resource. It was in the minutes, which I later requested through a formal disclosure petition after everything blew up. Karen had worded it diplomatically, but her intent was clear. There's an unused private well on Granger's lot. Given his distance from HOA utilities, perhaps we should consider a cooperative agreement. In emergencies only, of course. I wasn't even in the room, and they were planning how to exploit something I built with my own hands. And it wasn't just talk. 2 days after that visit, I noticed orange utility paint marks on the easement near my western fence line. They weren't from the county, I checked. They matched the brand of paint used by Oak Crest's landscaping crew, which reported to Karen directly. Then came the contractors. Not in HOA trucks, but in unmarked vehicles. I caught one kneeling near the wooded edge of my property line, pretending to check drainage flow with a laser level. When I asked him who hired him, he stuttered and said he was working for a private client. The next morning, the pressure in my kitchen faucet dropped for the first time. Karen was good at staying just out of reach, never writing anything down, never showing her face at the site. But her fingerprints were all over this. I could see it in the way the contractors refused to answer questions, in the way board members suddenly stopped making eye contact at meetings, in the way one of them, Tim from Lot 9, tried to casually ask if I might ever consider selling access rights to my well since it was going to waste back there. It was like watching termites eat through a beam you just inspected the day before, silent, hidden, but deadly. I kept quiet just like Stan advised, but inside I was boiling. You don't survive 3 decades in the Army without learning the difference between a mistake and an ambush. This wasn't carelessness. This was premeditated. It was strategic. They'd convinced themselves they could do it quietly, that I was some lonely old man too proud to fight back. And worse, they assumed the town would side with them if things ever got public. They had no idea who I was. I started recording everything. Every new marking in the dirt. Every time a contractor stepped on my side of the easement. I installed a game camera pointed toward the western fence and hid a second one facing the shed by the HOA greenbelt. And sure enough, it caught footage two men in reflective vests hauling PVC pipe under cover of night. No HOA uniforms, no lights, just shadows and shovels. I sent the footage to Stan. His reply came quickly. "Granger, this isn't just shady. This is theft. And if they're rerouting water through municipal land, they're messing with utility law. Keep watching. I'm building a case." But watching wasn't enough. I needed to know who else was involved. So I played a little game of bait. The following week, I showed up to the HOA meeting early enough to accidentally overhear Karen talking to Marla Jennings, the vice president. Karen's voice was hushed, but not careful. "We can't have Granger making noise about this. Just get the landscaping report filed under irrigation repair. If we bury it deep enough, no one's going to look twice." My blood went cold. They weren't just stealing from me, they were laundering it through paperwork, hiding it behind HOA work orders and budget lines. They had full board knowledge. This wasn't one rogue decision. This was organized, and it meant they'd go down together. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a day later when I walked out back to check the pressure gauge one more time and found it spinning, not erratic, not broken, but showing that water was being pulled at a volume I hadn't seen since I filled my fire barrel during the 2012 brush season. I hadn't turned on a single faucet. That meant the well was in use, somewhere else. They were already drawing water, possibly gallons by the hour, and I had no way of knowing how deep the theft had gone. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a manila folder thicker than a phone book. My hand hovered over the landline. I knew what had to happen next. It was time to take this to the state. Stan answered on the second ring. "You ready to go, official?" he asked. I nodded into the receiver. "I want an inspector here within 72 hours, and I want them to bring a warrant." Because now it wasn't just about my water. It was about every home in this town that didn't know its tap was about to run dry. The inspector's truck pulled up at 8:03 a.m. on a Thursday, just as the morning sun began to heat the dew off the grass. It wasn't just any inspector, it was Angela Ruiz, Senior Water Compliance Officer for the State Department of Environmental Resources. Stan had called in a favor, and I could tell by the way she stepped out of the vehicle, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp as broken glass, that she wasn't here for polite conversation. "Mr. Granger," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "you've got a pipe problem." I gave a dry chuckle. "You have no idea." Angela followed me to the back lot, her boots crunching against the gravel. She carried a pressure sensor, a tracer dye kit, and a portable ultrasound scanner, more equipment than I'd expected. I guided her through the overgrown trail that separated my well from the HOA's irrigation zone. When we reached the pump house, I pulled open the side panel to show her the tampered valve and the line that had no right to be there. She crouched down, her gloves already on. "This junction's not to code," she muttered, inspecting the clamp work. "And it's recent, less than a month. That copper oxidation hasn't even turned green yet." She reached into her case, pulled out a thin probe, and began inserting it down the auxiliary pipe. After a few moments of listening to the readings on her portable scanner, she stood up slowly. "The water's moving," she said. "You're not just supplying static access. This thing is active, continuous draw, probably routed somewhere with an unmetered outflow. That's felony-level misappropriation." I didn't need the technical terms. I knew what it was: theft. And worse, they were counting on me never noticing. Angela set up the tracer dye, a small vial of non-toxic bright blue solution, and injected it into the unauthorized line. "Now we wait," she said. "Wherever this water's going, it's about to glow like the 4th of July." We didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, Angela and I made our way to the HOA greenbelt. A small landscaping crew was busy trimming hedges near the utility shed, the same one I'd followed the pipe to. I recognized one of the workers, Doug, a regular contractor used by the HOA. He stiffened when he saw Angela's badge. Angela approached the shed and knocked once before yanking the door open. Inside, the smell of wet earth and chemicals was overwhelming. The hum of a small pump echoed in the space, and running along the back wall was a network of makeshift PVC piping valves and adapters. Angela crouched beside one of the junctions, turned the inspection light on, and nodded grimly. "Blue dyes here," she said. "Direct link from your wellhead." Doug stammered something about being told it was pre-approved and pointed vaguely in the direction of the HOA board office. Angela cut him off. Sir, step away from the equipment. This is a sealed inspection under state jurisdiction. He looked like he wanted to run, but thought better of it. Angela took photos of everything, every hose, every bolt, every inch of unauthorized infrastructure. She tagged the lines, sealed the system, and slapped a large red sticker on the pump. State seizure order. Do not tamper. When we returned to my cabin, Angela called Stan. Stan, it's confirmed. Direct illegal draw from a private well to a community utility structure. HOA infrastructure is benefiting without compensation, without contract, and without a permit. I'm filing a formal report and requesting legal escalation. Then she turned to me. Mr. Granger, I'm going to need your help preparing an affidavit, and I suggest you retain counsel. This is going to court. I nodded, already ahead of you. Truth was, I'd been in touch with a lawyer named Maggie Easton ever since I first found the unauthorized pipe. She wasn't cheap, but she was tenacious, a former environmental prosecutor turned private litigator. I'd met her years ago when I did consulting work on water security after I retired from the Army Corps of Engineers. Yes, that's right. I never mentioned it before. I wasn't just some old vet with a pickup and a tomato patch. I was once the regional supervisor for the Western Basin Resource Planning Initiative. I helped draft the very laws that Karen and her cronies had just broken. That afternoon, Maggie arrived with a briefcase full of forms and a fire in her voice. She'd already read Angela's preliminary notes and reviewed the footage from my cameras. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. They've siphoned thousands of gallons from your private supply, she said, sitting at my dining table, and used it to irrigate HOA green zones, fill ornamental fountains, and pressure wash sidewalks. All of it off the books, off the grid, and off your well. And with the town facing water restrictions, I said they'll want a scapegoat when everything runs dry. She smiled. And you're not going to be it. Maggie began drafting the cease and desist order that very night. But she didn't stop there. She filed a civil claim for damages, an emergency injunction to shut down all HOA water systems linked to the illegal pipe, and submitted formal requests for board communication logs. The next morning, subpoenas were served. Karen wasn't home when the county officer knocked, but her husband was, and judging by the pale expression he wore, when the envelope was handed over, he knew exactly what was inside. By noon, the HOA's front office was in full-blown crisis mode. Board members huddled in emergency meetings. The landscaping crew was pulled off-site. And someone tried very poorly to remove the blue dye from the shed's pipes with bleach. It didn't work. In fact, it made the stain worse. Angela filed criminal charges with the State Attorney General's office by the end of the week. And then, the drought hit. Hard. The municipal reservoirs dropped below critical levels. Mandatory watering bans went into effect. Outdoor fountains were shut off pools, drained car washes closed. The town, for the first time in a decade, entered Stage 3 water restrictions. Every household under the HOA's jurisdiction found their sprinklers locked, their faucets slow, and their toilets barely refilling. They were dry, brittle, parched, and confused. Except me. My well still flowed untouched, now with pressure restored and every valve secured under state seal. I had water. Cool, clean, reliable. And the town started to notice. They noticed my tomato vines still thriving. My animals still hydrated. My garden still green. They started asking questions. They started pointing fingers. And they started turning on Karen. The HOA emergency meeting was held in the Oak Crest Community Clubhouse on a sweltering Saturday morning just days after the drought declaration. The air inside the room was thick, not just from the heat, but from the tension rolling off the dozens of residents packed into every folding chair, leaning against every wall, fanning themselves with old newsletters and crumpled flyers. Karen stood at the front in her signature beige slacks and collared blouse, her hair wound into a tight, trembling bun that betrayed her nerves. She clutched the podium like it was the only thing keeping her upright. As you all know, she began, we're experiencing an unprecedented drought emergency. The HOA board is working tirelessly to cooperate with city officials to manage our community's water usage in accordance with state guidelines. Someone scoffed loudly from the back. I sat in the second row, arms folded, my presence alone enough to raise eyebrows. Normally, I avoided the spotlight. But today, I wanted Karen to feel the heat because this time, I wasn't just a quiet homeowner with a clipboard. I was the man they'd stolen from. The man they'd underestimated. Karen continued, her voice rising, like it could keep the murmurs at bay. We will be implementing additional conservation measures, including limited hose usage, temporary closure of non-essential amenities, and neighborhood-wide restrictions on. Tell us about the illegal pipe, Karen, a woman near the back shouted. It was Mrs. Ellington from Lot 43. She was usually docile, reserved. Not today. Karen flinched. I'm sorry. You heard her, a man barked from the left aisle. We've seen the news reports. We've seen the state inspector trucks. You stole water from someone's private well, didn't you? The crowd erupted. Voices rose like a wave, accusations, questions, outrage spilling into the open like floodwaters long held back. Karen's face drained of color. That's not accurate, she yelled over them. There's an ongoing investigation. Any assumptions you're making are premature and based on incomplete information. She shot me a look, then sharp, venomous, accusing. I stood slowly. No, Karen? I said, my voice steady but loud enough to quiet the room. What's premature is you assuming no one would notice. What's incomplete is your understanding of the law. And what's dead accurate is that I have photographic evidence, time-stamped footage, and state-confirmed tracer dye proving your HOA infrastructure was illegally pulling water from my well. A gasp rippled across the room. Someone whispered, he has proof. I took a step forward. You had no contract, no permission, no authorization, just entitlement and a rubber stamp from a board too lazy or too scared to question you. Karen's lips trembled. There was a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, I interrupted. You sent crews onto my land under cover of night. You forged utility work orders. You lied at multiple board meetings. You committed theft. Marla Jennings, the vice president, stood up from her chair at the head table. Let's all take a breath. I'm not interested in breathing, I said. I'm interested in accountability. Angela Ruiz entered the room right then, as if fate itself had decided to drop a hammer. She wore her department windbreaker, the official seal, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Excuse the interruption, she said, holding up a folded letter. I have an official statement to read from the Office of the State Attorney General. The room went silent. Angela opened the letter and began. Effective immediately. The state of California is launching a formal investigation into Oak Crest Homeowners Association for the unlawful diversion of private water resources, violation of state water conservation orders, and the unauthorized construction of utility infrastructure on private land. Murmurs turned into audible shock. The state reserves the right to press criminal charges against individuals found responsible. In the meantime, the HOA is ordered to cease all non-essential water usage and submit full infrastructure records for forensic audit within 10 business days. Angela closed the letter and looked directly at Karen. We also have a separate injunction pending against you personally, Ms. Wilmot. Karen's knees seemed to buckle slightly. She grabbed the edge of the podium for balance. This was never, she stammered. But it was too late. A woman stood up near the front. My kids haven't had a full shower in days. I've had to haul water from the next county for my elderly father, another resident added. My backyard died while she watered flower beds around the HOA sign. The voices surged like a dam finally broken. Karen tried to speak, tried to regain the room, but every word landed like ash in a wildfire. The residents weren't just angry, they felt betrayed. They'd trusted her with their dues, their bylaws, their homes. And now, in the middle of a state-declared drought, they were learning she had funneled stolen water to beautify sidewalks and pressure wash a community pool while elderly residents rationed baths. Let's vote, someone shouted. Vote to remove her. Karen's eyes widened. You can't, this meeting isn't scheduled for. You're suspended, Marla said quietly but firmly. Effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. Karen turned on her. You were in this with me. Marla didn't blink. No. I asked questions. You shut me down. Then Karen turned toward me. You think you've won, she hissed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The town had responded for me. As Karen stormed out of the clubhouse, a small group of residents followed not to support her, but to ensure she didn't tamper with any more infrastructure on the way out. The rest stayed behind. I sat down again, slow and quiet. Angela leaned toward me and whispered, You're just getting started. I nodded, because I knew what was coming next. The legal storm, and I was ready. In the days that followed Karen's public collapse, things in Oak Crest didn't settle. They just shifted. The neighborhood simmered like a pot that had boiled over and was now burning the bottom. On the surface, people returned to their routines. Sprinklers remained off lawns, turned brittle HOA emails came with softer tones. But beneath that, suspicion brewed. People watched each other more carefully. Whispers spread at the mailbox kiosks and outside the community center. Karen had vanished from public view, but her shadow still loomed over every conversation. As for me, I wasn't celebrating. I'd learned a long time ago victory isn't the end of a war. It's often just the prelude to the next battle. Angela had warned me it could get messy. "We have enough for a civil case," she said, "but if there's a paper trail, a network, anyone else tied to the decision contracts, forged records, even misuse of HOA funds, we need to get ahead of it." That's when I decided to take things further. You see, I'd spent most of my life building infrastructure in places where water wasn't just a utility, it was a lifeline. In Afghanistan, in South Sudan, in remote U.S. desert bases, I'd helped design water systems that couldn't fail. I knew how things could be buried, rerouted, hidden. If there were more pipes, hidden tanks, undocumented valves, if this water theft was deeper than just one pipe, I'd find it. And I did. I started by revisiting the camera footage for my property, this time with a keener eye. One video taken 2 nights before I discovered the splice in my well line showed a second crew arriving after midnight. Different truck, different tools. One man stood watch while the others worked behind the HOA greenbelt shed, and when they left, they loaded something heavy like a portable pump system into the bed of the truck. It didn't match any HOA service logs. I flagged the footage, clipped it, and filed it into my growing investigation archive. Next, I walked the perimeter of the neighborhood, legally carefully sticking to public easements. I wasn't just looking for infrastructure, I was watching people. HOA board members especially. I noted who suddenly stopped watering entirely, and who still seemed to have green grass despite restrictions. That was when I noticed a pattern. 3 properties, Lot 7. Lot 12 and Lot 18 still had soft lawns, glistening sidewalks, and thriving rose bushes even after 2 full weeks of Level 3 restrictions. All 3 were current or former HOA board members. Coincidence maybe, but I doubted it. I paid a visit to Stan at the county water office. He scanned the list of addresses I handed him and raised an eyebrow. 2 of these homes submitted recent utility permits, claims that they had independent water sources. Said they dug shallow wells before the HOA expanded. I blinked. Did they? Stan shrugged. They submitted affidavits. No one ever inspected. I leaned forward. I think they tapped into my system or Karen's bypass. I think this was coordinated. Stan whistled low. If that's true, you're not just looking at HOA theft. That's conspiracy. We'd need a hydrologist to confirm underground connections and pressure sources, maybe bring in a forensic plumber. I nodded. Can we start that process? He gave me a grim smile. With pleasure. While Stan filed the requests, I turned my attention to another target, the HOA budget records. Legally, as a resident, I was entitled to review public records of how dues were spent. I submitted a request, and 3 days later a packet arrived in my mailbox. One of those thick envelopes you don't expect unless you're dealing with medical bills or lawsuits. Inside were printouts of quarterly expenses, vendor receipts, contractor payments. A lot of it was boilerplate mowing, tree trimming, pest control. But one line item stood out. Water management consultation, $14,850. Vendor Oasis Infrastructure Group. That line had been buried in the third quarter report listed under beautification projects. But I'd never heard of Oasis Infrastructure Group, and I certainly hadn't seen any water consultants in the neighborhood. I looked them up. They didn't have a website. But they did have a state business registration filed only 8 months ago by none other than Doug Keller, the same landscaping foreman who'd tried to bleach out the tracer dye. It all started to come together. Karen had authorized an off-the-books consulting contract with a shell company formed by her preferred contractor. That company had billed the HOA, meaning the residents, for a fake service while quietly rerouting water for privileged board members. It was theft, fraud, and abuse of power wrapped in one carefully scripted operation. I handed everything over to Maggie. She reviewed it, then sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. They thought they were clever, she said. But they left just enough breadcrumbs. We have enough, I asked. More than enough. That night, I sat on my back porch watching the dusk settle over my yard. The tomato plants were wilting under the heat, but still alive, fed by clean legal water. The air was still, but I could feel the change coming. In my bones. In the way people looked at me differently now. Neighbors waved longer. A few left notes on my porch, thank yous, apology letters, even home-baked bread from the Martinez kids, 2 houses over. I didn't ask for recognition. I didn't want a statue. But for the first time since this all began, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. After the military, I'd drifted a bit. This land grounded me. The routine gave me peace. But this fight, this clarity, it reminded me that some battles still needed fighting. Not with bullets, but with truth. With quiet resolve. With facts, persistence, and the kind of patience most people underestimated. The HOA had picked the wrong man to steal from. And now they were going to learn what that meant. The first time I heard the phrase, Level 4 water emergency, it came over the radio while I was driving back from the courthouse with Maggie. We had just filed an expansion of our civil suit, adding 3 board members as co-defendants, based on the shell company contract and the consultation payments I'd uncovered. We'd expected pushback. What we didn't expect was for nature itself to come charging in like a second plaintiff. The governor had just declared a statewide water crisis. Oak Crest, along with our entire county, was entering the highest level of water restrictions ever enforced. No outdoor watering, no car washes, no pool refills. Water was now rationed, monitored, and strictly limited. The city's reservoir had dropped so low they were helicoptering in emergency tanks from neighboring counties. Farmers were in crisis. School fountains shut down. Even the fire department issued public warnings about conserving pressure for emergencies. But in Oak Crest, it was worse. Why? Because the HOA under Karen's leadership had drained our emergency reserves long before the drought was declared. While most neighborhoods still had backup tanks or pressure relief valves, Oak Crest had repurposed theirs for an ornamental koi pond behind the clubhouse, a project Karen had pitched as aesthetic rejuvenation. That pond had been emptied a week prior, but the damage was done. By Monday morning, the phones at the HOA office were melting. People were furious. Faucets were sputtering or running brown. A few homes had no pressure at all. Toilet tanks didn't refill. Entire families were driving 40 minutes out of town just to fill jugs at fire stations. And through it all, my property remained untouched. I had water. Not because I was hoarding, but because I'd always managed my supply independently. My well hadn't been affected by the municipal shutdowns. I still rationed, I didn't water the lawn, didn't run sprinklers, but I could shower, cook, flush, live. The town noticed. By Wednesday, there were cars parked at the end of my gravel drive. Neighbors knocking politely. Some asking for jugs of water, others just wanting to understand how I'd done it. I wasn't a hero in their eyes. I was a curiosity. A lifeline. A man who had seen something coming and built a life that could withstand it. I gave what I could. Set up a spigot by the fence line, with a limit 5 gallons per household. Free. No names, no questions. I didn't make a show of it, but word spread fast. And Karen heard it. That afternoon, she showed up unannounced. I was checking the flow meter by the garden when her Lexus pulled up, kicking dust in the air. She stepped out dressed in muted tones, but her posture was still rigid, defensive. Her eyes scanned the makeshift water line I'd set up near the road where an elderly man was slowly filling 2 jugs for his wife. "David," she said coldly, "we need to talk." I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about, Karen. You're not allowed on my property." She stepped 1 foot onto the gravel path. "I came to ask you to shut it down." That made me pause. I turned to her slowly. "You want me to shut off water access for people who have none? It's undermining HOA protocols," she said, voice clipped. "It's making the board look negligent." I took a step forward, wiping my hands on a rag. "The board is negligent. It stole water, covered it up, then blamed the drought. And now you want to take the only clean water left from these people? It's unsanctioned," she snapped. "It's outside the HOA's purview." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You're not HOA president anymore, and this land isn't inside your purview. Remember, you tried to steal from it. You don't get to lecture me about policy." Her face reddened. "The board could issue a cease and desist. And the state will laugh in your face," I said. "You're being investigated for infrastructure tampering and environmental violations, Karen. You've got bigger problems than my garden hose." She looked around at the small line forming near the fence, a mother with 2 toddlers, a man in work boots, with a cracked plastic barrel. Then she looked back at me. "This isn't over," she said quietly. I stepped forward until we were just a foot apart. "It is for you." She turned and left without another word. That evening, Maggie called. Her voice buzzed with energy. "They just filed a response to our suit," she said, "and it's desperate. Denials finger-pointing claims of rogue contractors." But the best part? One of the board members flipped. "Who?" "Marla Jennings. She's agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. She gave us copies of internal emails, proof that Karen authorized the bypass line into your well. Proof that she lied during the HOA budget meetings. And get this, there's a memo showing they knew the drought was coming and did nothing to prepare." I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. "How soon can we go public?" I asked. "We don't have to," Maggie said. "The county's holding a town hall next week. The DA's office is attending. So is the local news." Outside, the sun was setting, casting golden light across the hills. The spigot at my fence line still flowed. A young girl waved as her dad filled a jug. I raised my hand in return. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about trust. About a community starved not just by drought, but by lies. And slowly I realized what had started as an act of self-preservation had turned into something more. Something vital. They came for my well, but they awoke something they couldn't control. It was a Thursday morning when the faucets went dry completely. Not a sputter, not a drop. Just a hollow hiss and a sudden silence that fell over every household like a curse. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. Air conditioner-strained pets panted in the shade, and kids sat listlessly inside darkened homes with blinds drawn. But the worst part wasn't the heat. It was the helplessness. Because for the first time in living memory, Oak Crest wasn't just under restriction, it was out of water. I heard about it from 3 people before I even stepped off my porch. A mother and her teenage son, who had driven all the way from Lot 29 just to ask if I could spare enough for them to flush their toilet. A contractor with cracked lips and dust-covered boots who'd been installing drywall all morning and now had nothing to drink. And then came old Mr. Hartley, barely able to stand in the heat holding a plastic jug that was only a third full. "I've lived here 35 years, he said. "Not once have we gone bone dry." I filled his jug in silence and told him to come back after dark when the flow was strongest. That's when I heard the screaming. It came from down the hill, echoing through the canyon like an animal caught in a trap. At first, I thought it was someone hurt, then I recognized the voice. High-pitched, shrill, shaking with rage. "Karen." I left the spigot running, climbed into my truck, and rolled down slowly toward Oak Crest Drive. The clubhouse was surrounded. A crowd had gathered, residents waving empty jugs, barking questions, filming on phones. And at the center of it all stood Karen, unhinged and sweating mascara streaking down her face, pointing her phone at a small, sweaty intern from the water department who was trying his best to explain the obvious. "This is a violation of public trust," she shrieked. "We pay taxes, we pay dues. Where is the water?" The intern stammered. "Ma'am, as I said, Oak Crest's reserves were depleted due to improper, unauthorized infrastructure usage. And due to your current litigation." "I never authorized anything," she snapped. "This is slander. This is libel. This is a personal attack from that man with his tin roof cabin and his stupid tomatoes." I raised an eyebrow. Someone in the crowd turned and spotted me. "There he is," they whispered. "That's the guy with the water." Dozens of heads turned. Suddenly I was facing a wall of faces, desperate and pleading. But it wasn't anger, not at me. It was hope. It was the kind of look soldiers used to give me overseas when the water tank finally rolled into camp. Karen turned too, and when our eyes met, something inside her cracked. She shoved her phone into her purse and stormed forward, heels clacking against the concrete. "You smug bastard," she hissed. "You think this makes you a hero. You think hoarding water makes you righteous." I didn't respond. She jabbed a finger into my chest. "You set me up. You poisoned the board against me. You created this entire media circus." I held her gaze unmoving. "You stole from me," I said softly. She blinked. "What?" "You stole from me," I repeated. "You trespassed on my land, tapped into my well, and lied to the community about it. And now, when the town needs leadership, all you offer is blame." "I built this neighborhood," she snapped. "No," I said. "You built control. You built a stage to feed your ego." But the second the pressure rose, you cracked. The crowd was listening now, quiet, watching her unravel. Karen's voice rose again. You think this is over? I still have support. I'll sue you for defamation, for trespassing, for... You'll be lucky, I said, if the state doesn't sue you for endangerment. Angela Ruiz appeared behind me, then, calm as always, flanked by 2 deputies, and a woman in a gray blazer I hadn't seen before. She introduced herself as County Prosecutor Dana Caldwell. Ms. Wilmot Dana said you've been named in a criminal complaint filed by the state of California for infrastructure tampering, unlawful diversion of private resources, and gross negligence under emergency conditions. You'll be receiving official notice this afternoon. Karen turned pale. You're blaming me for the drought. No, Dana said. We're blaming you for making it worse. The deputies didn't cuff her. Not yet. But they didn't need to. The humiliation alone was a sentence she would never outrun. Karen staggered back toward her car, muttering to herself, her once pristine reputation crumbling with every step. Someone took a photo. Another person booed. But most just stood silently processing the truth that the person they trusted to protect their homes had gambled with their most basic need. After she drove off, Dana turned to me. We're freezing all HOA-controlled assets, she said. Pending the outcome of this case, the board will be restructured. Elections will be supervised by the county. Angela added, and we're redirecting emergency tanker deliveries to supplement your well. You'll be reimbursed and a hydrant connection will be installed by week's end. I nodded, overwhelmed but steady. What about the residents? You keep doing what you're doing, Dana said. You've already done more than the HOA ever did. I drove home slowly that afternoon, the sun bleeding orange through the sky. When I pulled up to my fence, the line of cars had doubled. People had brought shade tents, now chairs, even coolers to help distribute water. Kids played with empty jugs like toys. An elderly woman handed out peanut butter sandwiches. And as I stepped out of the truck, the entire line looked up and clapped. Not for a hero, but for a neighbor. One who hadn't turned away. One who remembered that water, like trust, wasn't something you hoarded. It was something you shared. By the time the emergency town hall convened at the community center, Oak Crest was a neighborhood transformed. Gone were the perfect lawns and uniform hedges Karen had once obsessed over. In their place stood wilted flower beds, dusty sidewalks, and front yards where neighbors had erected makeshift shade tents to survive the afternoon heat. But something else had taken root, something far more resilient than hydrangeas or turf grass. Community. In the wake of the drought and the scandal, people had begun talking to each other again. Real conversations, not the stiff smiles exchanged during morning walks or HOA barbecues. They brought extra water jugs to neighbors in need. They knocked on doors they'd ignored for years, and they came together to demand answers. That night, the community center overflowed with residents. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs scraped the linoleum floor as people squeezed into rows. Reporters stood in the back, cameras perched on tripods. There were whispers of lawsuit criminal charges and state oversight rippling through the crowd. At the front table sat the remaining HOA board members, Marla Jennings among them. Head bowed, flanked by 2 other directors who looked like they'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The seat at the center, Karen's old throne, was conspicuously empty. Mayor Thomas Weaver took the podium. He was a practical man with deep creases around his eyes, known more for keeping the county budget balanced than for wading into HOA drama. But tonight he stood tall, holding a folder in one hand and a stack of documents in the other. I appreciate everyone coming out on short notice, he began, voice echoing slightly off the wood-paneled walls. We're here to address a matter that goes beyond local governance. What's happened in Oak Crest is not just a violation of state law, it's a violation of trust. He held up the folder. This contains sworn affidavits, photographs, invoices, and internal emails. Evidence of a coordinated effort by members of the Oak Crest HOA to illegally siphon water from a private well, divert it through unauthorized infrastructure, and use it to maintain aesthetic standards during a time of mounting drought. There was a murmur through the room. But perhaps most disturbing, he continued, is that these actions not only violated environmental and property laws, they depleted the community's own emergency reserves, leaving hundreds of residents without access to clean water when they needed it most. He paused, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. Marla raised her hand slowly. Mr. Mayor, if I may. He nodded. She stood visibly trembling, but resolute. I was part of the board that approved several landscaping initiatives, she said. But I was misled. Karen Wilmot presented the Oasis contract as a legitimate consultation. She claimed we were connecting to a county-approved auxiliary line. I asked questions, but she deflected or outright dismissed them. Her voice cracked. I didn't know we were stealing water. And when I did suspect something, I didn't act quickly enough. For that, I am deeply sorry. The room was quiet. People were listening. She looked around. I know some of you will never forgive me. That's fair. But I want to be clear, I'm cooperating fully with the state investigation. I've submitted every document I had access to. And effective tonight, I resigned from the HOA board. There were a few nods, a few arms crossed, but no one heckled. No one stood up to scream. It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. Then the mayor turned to the audience. Now I'd like to invite someone else to speak, he said. Someone who played a key role in uncovering this entire situation, and who frankly reminded us all what community leadership should look like. He looked toward me. I froze. People turned in their chairs, eyes locking onto me. I hadn't planned to speak. I'd come to observe, to listen, to make sure they didn't bury the truth. But as I rose and made my way to the front, I saw faces I recognized. People I'd shared water with. People I'd once waved at from a distance, but now knew by name. I took the mic. My name is David Granger, I said. And for most of the past year, I was the guy no one talked to. The guy with the well and the ugly mailbox. The guy who didn't go to HOA picnics or decorate for holidays. A few people chuckled quietly. But I wasn't the only one ignored. This whole neighborhood got used to staying quiet. We let a handful of people make all the rules. We let them fine us, bully us, and shame us for not meeting some artificial standard of perfection. And then, when things got tough, when we needed leadership, they gave us lies. I looked straight at the board members, still seated. What they took from me wasn't just water. It was peace. It was trust. And if we don't rebuild those things together, this won't be the last time something like this happens. There were nods, murmurs of agreement. We need transparency. We need accountability. And we need an HOA that works for us, not against us. Applause began to ripple through the room. Not wild, not explosive, but genuine. The mayor stepped forward again. Effective immediately, he said, Oak Crest HOA will be placed under temporary receivership. A special election will be held within 60 days, supervised by a third-party mediator to elect a new board. Financial audits are already underway. And in the meantime, water distribution will be managed jointly by the county and Mr. Granger's volunteer system. There was a standing ovation. People weren't cheering for a government mandate. They were cheering for a second chance. After the meeting, people came up to shake my hand, offer thanks, even ask if I'd run for HOA president. I declined. I didn't do this to lead, I said. I did it because no one else would. That night, the air smelled different. Not cleaner, not cooler, but lighter. Like something had lifted off the neighborhood's shoulders. And for the first time in months, I slept with my windows open. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The kind of cold that crept into your sleeves and settled there, a quiet reminder that justice wasn't always warm or welcoming. It was late September by then, and though the air outside still carried summer's weight inside those walls, everything felt clinical, frozen in procedure and fluorescent light. I sat beside Maggie at the plaintiff's table, a binder of evidence in front of me, but I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Every photo, every timestamp, every contractor invoice and internal HOA memo was burned into my memory like names on a gravestone. Across the aisle sat Karen Wilmot, her new lawyer, whispering frantically in her ear, while she stared straight ahead, lips pressed so tightly they'd turned white. She looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing. Maybe it was the cheap gray blazer. Maybe it was the absence of power. Or maybe it was the weight of knowing the entire town was watching. Because they were. Rows of Oak Crest residents had shown up for the hearing. Some stood against the back wall. Others leaned in the doorway. There were even people watching from a nearby overflow room with a live stream broadcast onto a projection screen. It wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. The charges were serious criminal infrastructure, tampering, misappropriation of funds, theft of private resources, and environmental negligence during a declared state emergency. The civil suit Maggie had filed on my behalf was being heard alongside the criminal case, and while the judge had separated the verdicts, the evidence was nearly identical. Testimony began with Angela Ruiz. She was direct, unshaken, and ruthlessly professional as she walked the court through her findings: the illegal pipe connected to my well, the forensic tracing of the dye, the video evidence from my trail, Cam's the altered maintenance records submitted by the HOA. Next came Marla Jennings. She entered the witness box like someone climbing a mountain, barefoot, painfully aware of each step. Her voice was quiet, but every word hit like a dropped stone. Karen told us she had verbal clearance from the county, she said. She insisted the well was underutilized and that Mr. Granger wouldn't even notice. Did you believe her? The prosecutor asked. I did, Marla admitted. At first, but when I asked for documentation, she claimed it had been lost. When I pushed again, she removed me from the subcommittee overseeing water management. Did you authorize the use of Granger's well? No, she said. If I had known what she was really doing, I would have gone straight to the county. Karen's lawyer tried to discredit her, claimed she was throwing Karen under the bus to save herself. But Marla never wavered, and the jury listened. Then came the documents. The invoices to Oasis Infrastructure Group signed by Karen. The water usage logs showing illegal spikes during off hours. The HOA meeting notes with coded language like alternative sourcing and redundancy solutions. Karen's defense was thin. She claimed ignorance, blamed rogue contractors, claimed she had relied on bad advice, and thought the well was part of shared easement access, a legal argument that crumbled when the land, deeds, and boundaries were presented in court. Finally, Maggie called me to testify. I walked to the stand, slowly feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on me, not with pressure, but with expectation. These were my neighbors, my community. People I had once waved to out of habit and now knew by name. I told the truth. About the first day, I noticed the drop in water pressure. About the odd questions Karen asked. About the fake utility markings, the unmarked trucks, the confrontation at the HOA meeting, the silence from the board. The night I discovered the pipe, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I just told them what happened. And when I was done, I looked at the jury and said, this wasn't just about stealing water. It was about the belief that no one would fight back. When I returned to my seat, Maggie leaned over and whispered that was perfect. The deliberation didn't take long. Karen was found guilty on all counts in the criminal trial. The judge, a stoic man with silver hair and a no-nonsense tone, sentenced her to 2 years probation, 6 months of house arrest, and 500 hours of community service, most of it to be served assisting municipal water conservation programs. It wasn't prison, but it was justice. In the civil case, the HOA was ordered to pay damages, $87,000 for the cost of the stolen water, property trespass, and punitive harm. An additional $35,000 was granted in legal fees. But more important than the money was the precedent the judge ruled that HOA boards could not operate in a vacuum of self-interest. That residents had the right to legal remedy when leadership acted in bad faith. The court also froze HOA accounts temporarily and placed the organization under third-party financial oversight for 1 full year. When it was over, the reporters swarmed, but I said nothing. I walked out of the courthouse and down the marble steps into the cool autumn air where a small group of neighbors waited. Someone clapped, then another, and soon the sidewalk echoed with applause, not loud, not wild, but full of something deeper. Gratitude. One man, his hands calloused and thick from years in construction, stepped forward. You didn't just save your well, he said. You saved this neighborhood. I shook his hand. I just wanted the truth. He nodded. Well, now we all have it. That night, I stood by my garden hose in hand, watering the soil slowly. The air smelled like dust and redemption. The tomatoes were almost done for the season. But I didn't mind, because next spring they'd grow again. This time in a town that finally understood what roots were for. The first real rain came 3 weeks later. Not a storm, not a flood, just a steady, soaking fall that rolled in quietly before dawn and washed the brittle dust from every rooftop and leaf. It clung to the wind chimes on my porch like a lullaby. I sat beneath the eaves with a blanket over my shoulders, a cup of hot coffee in my hands, and listened to the way the earth drank. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. Karen's name had all but disappeared from the neighborhood except in whispers or clipped references when someone passed the now vacant HOA office. The board had been dissolved officially 2 days after the trial, replaced by a temporary committee overseen by an external mediator. Marla Jennings had recused herself. Several others left Oak Crest entirely. A special election was scheduled for November, and this time the candidates weren't lawyers or business owners with control complexes. They were parents, teachers, a retired nurse, a postal worker. People who understood that managing a community meant listening before leading, and they all knocked on doors themselves. That alone told me things had changed. As for me, I never joined the new board. I declined gently over a handshake and a firm no. But I offered to serve as an advisor on emergency infrastructure. I wanted no titles, no salary, just a seat at the table when real decisions were being made. They said yes. The town kept coming to my fence for weeks after the trial ended. At first, it was just for water. Then it was to check in, bring cookies, ask how the tomatoes were doing. Someone dropped off a watercolor painting of my pump house. Another neighbor gave me a small wood sign they'd carved. The man with the well. I hung it next to my tool shed. The makeshift spigot I'd installed by the road stayed in place even after the city restored full water access. I let it flow once a day just for an hour, even if no one came. It was symbolic now. Not just a utility, but a gesture. A reminder of what happens when we stop being afraid to take care of each other. Angela Ruiz stopped by once weeks after everything had settled. She brought coffee and 2 breakfast burritos from the corner taqueria. "Still got that camera pointed at the fence?" she asked with a smile. I nodded. Old habits. She leaned against the railing, unwrapping her burrito. "You know you changed policy. States rewriting guidelines for HOA infrastructure access, mandatory reporting, audit schedules, the works." "Glad I could help," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You didn't have to do all this." "Didn't I?" She smiled. "Guess you did." Maggie visited too this time. Without the briefcase, just a thermos, and her rescue mutt named Tank, who promptly marked 3 corners of my yard like he owned the deed. She'd gone semi-viral after the trial. Her closing argument had made local news then spread online. HOA watchdog groups quoted her now. She'd even been invited to speak at a national conference. "I've been offered a job in D.C., she told me one afternoon. "Policy work, legal reform." "You'll do good work," I said. "You should come speak with me," she replied. "You've got a voice people listen to. I've got tomatoes to water." We both laughed. But something lingered in her expression, a kind of reverence. Not for me. For what this place had become. Because Oak Crest wasn't perfect, but it was real again. Kids rode bikes down the street without dodging HOA patrol cars. Residents painted their fences whatever color they pleased. People planted gardens again, shared fruit, helped patch up each other's pipes. We had a town bulletin board now, no longer locked behind glass or curated by Karen's newsletters. Just push-pins announcements, hand-drawn flyers, and scribbled thank you notes. And once a week, someone tacked up a joke. "Hydrate before you legislate," or "In wells we trust." Even I couldn't help but smile. One morning in late October, a teenage girl named Lila came by my porch. She wore a school hoodie, carried a notepad, and introduced herself as the editor of the high school paper. "I'm writing a piece," she said, "about how communities survive disaster. I want to include your story." "It's not really mine," I told her. "It's ours." She grinned. Even better. I sat with her for an hour answering her questions, trying not to sound like a sermon. When she asked what I learned most from the whole thing, I paused, then said, "That water is a lot like trust. If you don't protect it, someone will steal it. If you hoard it, everyone suffers. But if you share it, it flows further than you can imagine." She wrote that down, underlined it twice. Before she left, she asked one more question. "Are you angry at Karen?" I thought about that for a long time after she left. And the truth was no, I wasn't. Not anymore. Because anger burns quick and hot. But what I wanted, what we all needed, was something that would last. Something deeper than punishment. Something more powerful than revenge. Justice, yes. But also healing. And sometimes that begins not in a courtroom or a policy memo, but with a bucket of water left out for a neighbor in need. So I kept the well flowing. Kept the gate unlocked. And when the next summer came, Oak Crest didn't wither. It bloomed.